Well guys, rather bigger fish than I was expecting. Took my line around that metal grate. The double-edged sword of fishing around structure. It's where the fish like to be, but this tends to happen. I figured out, just put a few wines worth of monofilament, 20-pound monofilament down over the braid. Can get rid of the casting problem because we're really just pitching it a few feet. I can still put on a slightly stronger hook. I'm just gonna free line it. If that is what I think it was, it should take again. Ooh, really nice, really feisty bullhead catfish. Yeah, this is quite a large one for the species. Really pretty fish. Long and cylindrical. You can see that scrape right there. That's indicative of a catfish's breeding behavior. They bite each other quite hard when they're inbreeding. Really a lovely fish. Massive barbels. Big, huge paddle of a tail. From the front, it really does take on the characteristics visually of a UK catfish, or what's more commonly known as the Wales catfish. Very similar looking animal in many respects, in miniature. So a couple of tips on catching bullhead catfish. And I know that you can kind of partially see me, kind of partially can't. It's a little bit of an apocalypse now thing going on. But that actually has a lot to do with how to catch a bullhead catfish. The most important aspect of it is your location. And that could be said of basically catching any fish. A location has a lot to do with it. Habitat, because these are wild animals. They're not found just anywhere. But this type of habitat, this overgrown, almost jungle-type terrain, seems to be where I find the most bullheads in the southern part of Texas. You can find a lot of rivers and streams and lakes that are nice and clean and clear and easy to cast into, but it is these nasty close-quarter tangles where I think bullheads really tend to lie up the most. Now normally Oyster Creek is a fairly shallow creek by all accounts. It is flooded a little bit right now. The water behind me is about a foot higher than usual, and because of that it's moving a lot faster than usual. The banks are really, really steep, so it doesn't give the water a lot of room to expand. So the water is moving through a relatively similar amount of space in a much greater volume, so it's a little bit stronger. And that is not as good for bullhead catfishing, but as you've seen, you can still get them. Now there's two places to cast in a creek like this where I think you're going to have the most success for bullhead catfish. Number one is the very bottom and the very center of the water source. Generally speaking, when the water is at its normal levels, the deepest you can get your bait is where I tend to see the most success occur. When it's flooded like this, and this is just something that all catfish tend to do, when a water body is flooded, the catfish tend to move out of the main body of current, and they will move into the pockets of forest that have been flooded. So what you want to look for is you'll want to look for a pocket of the creek where the current has slowed down, a nice slack. And you want to cast into that, preferably if it's got a lot of overhangs and tangles. Channel catfish and bullhead catfish both really love spots like that. I just missed the fish, and that illustrates another good point about fishing for these animals, these bullhead catfish. Their take, when they actually do take your bait, is very, very soft compared to most other catfish. Most catfish will pick up a bait and they'll either sit with it for a minute and then move off, or just start moving immediately. But what they all share in common is that when they do move off, they usually do it, you know, not so subtly. They're very strong animals. And when they take a bait, you know they've taken the bait. Bullhead catfish are exactly the opposite. They're incredibly subtle. They have the subtlest bite of any catfish, in my opinion. So when you set, there you go, cast out again. When you cast and your bait is set in the water, a lot of the times when I'm carp fishing, what you'll see me do is I will use a bobbin. Basically, it's a signal on the line. And there's different ways you can do this. You can use a bobbin on a rod rest. You can use a bell. You can, use like what they call a quiver tip rod, or use your rod in that fashion where you're watching for the quiver at the end of it. But I find generally the take of these catfish is so subtle, the most success you're going to have is touch lettering, just like this, feeling the line. It really is a lot more like a sunfish is taking your bait. Quite often I've hooked into bullhead catfish after I thought I had hooked into a sunfish, just because the take is so fiddly. Now for bait, you can't get more simple than fishing for bullhead catfish. I think the god of all fishing baits in freshwater are worms. I do, and a lot of people might disagree with that, but again, there's no right and wrong answer here. It's all personal preference and personal experience. For me, personally, in South Texas, fishing for fish in freshwater in South Texas, I have had the most success using worms. However, when you're fishing for bullhead catfish or any species of catfish, when you use worms, you are competing with sunfish, and they are much quicker to the bait than catfish, and they're much more precise with their bites. And what will generally happen when you're using worms to catch small catfish, you've got a segment of worm that's going to be attacked and taken by perch before it gets taken by a catfish. 9 times out of 10, that is what I found happens. So what I like to do is I like to use a hook that is just a little bit too big for sunfish. Because remember, bullhead catfish have the mouth about that wide. You don't want to use a huge hook. So I like to use a hook that's a little bit too big for sunfish, and I like to use meaty baits. And I've got a hot dog here. Catfishing can be extremely cheap, and I have found that all strongly scented meaty baits will work for bullhead catfish. Chicken liver, chicken heart is an exceptional bait for them. Lots of blood to put in the water, and the bait is incredibly durable. I've used chicken hearts and caught multiple bowfin, which is a very sharp-toothed fish, on the same piece of bait. So it's a very durable bait you can get back. And I find that even though sunfish will take raw meat, they are less likely to take it. The catfish tend to find it before the sunfish do, as long as you're fishing on the bottom. Now, another really important component of your terminal tackle is your hook choice. And catfish, if you catch catfish, you know where I'm going with this. They swallow baits. They inhale them so fast, which is especially problematic with the bullhead catfish because their take is so subtle. They have a lot of time to swallow that hook before you might realize there's a fish on the line. I got a fish on the line right now. Oh, it's a big fish too. We interrupt this program to bring in a really big fish. Lord, I honestly have no clue what this is. Oh, because it's not a fish. It is a big animal, but the point I was going to illustrate applies to this guy too. In fact, this is a point I was going to directly address. When you're fishing for catfish, just bear with me, you need to use a hook with a long shank if you can get one, because catfish tend to swallow baits. You will also, you will also be fishing in water. If you plan on catching a bullhead catfish, you will be fishing in water that is infested with turtles. Some of them, like this guy, can grow exceptionally large. Let me unhook him, and then I will tell you. There you go. Got that hook back. So even if you plan on killing the catfish that you're catching, whether or not you want to use it for bait, because bullhead catfish do make great baits for flatheads and other types of larger catfish, it's still a real pain to cut them up and get the hook out. A longer shank lets you unhook the fish relatively quickly. Now, the second point, or important point rather, of having a long shanked hook is that you are likely to catch a turtle when you are fishing for bullhead catfish. And turtles also take hooks incredibly deep because they have a sensitive take. Turtles have a very fiddly take, and when you're expecting a fish on the line, you're going to sit there and you're going to feel it out and feel it out, and what you want to feel is that solid take from that fish. What you don't realize is that it's a turtle who has already partially swallowed your hook, and that fiddly movement that you're feeling is that turtle starting to just kind of change position, and by the time you set that hook, it's usually in the throat. Now, this turtle I'm about to show you did not get throat hooked. It was in the corner of his mouth. I got it out nice and fine. The longer the shank of your hook, the easier it is to do that with your turtles. So when we get this guy out, I have to be very careful because it is a massive soft shell, and they have a particularly strong bite. Look at this guy. It's the third one I've caught today. They have a particularly strong bite for turtles, and really sharp claws. You can see the claw down by my right hand, incredibly sharp. They are excellent diggers. They use those for digging burrows. Look at that guy. You can see how, there you can see how big he is. He's a pretty big turtle. There you go. Lovely guy. And he was hooked right in the corner of the lip. You can see there's no blood. This turtle is going to recover a-okay. Let's put him down. Get out of here, buddy. He's gone. And because I had a hook with a relatively long shank, I was able to unhook that turtle very easily. Another very important tip within the same vein, and this is going to help you in a lot of situations, but especially for catfish and when you're dealing with turtles, I would highly recommend that you crush, there you get that focus, you crush the barbs down on your hook. This is a barbless hook. I didn't buy it that way. You can, but they're hard to find. You got to order them usually. So I buy my hooks and then I crush the barbs down myself. So this hook, even though it was, completely through the edge of that turtle's lip, came out just as easy. So there's not a whole lot of prying and, fighting with your animal here while you're trying to get a hook out of its mouth, because the longer that hook is in a turtle's mouth, the worse it is going to be for you and the turtle. Short rod, spinning reel, decent strength line without going too heavy, monofilament trace, long shanked barbless hook, or crush the barbs down with pliers, meaty bait. Definitely keep a pair of needle nose pliers with you, or a hook disgorger, one of the long red ones that I have, or the types of red ones that I have. You can't have mine. And you want to be fishing these tangled up, jungle-esque, slow-moving, narrow, shallow, muddy creeks. That is my best advice for catching bullhead catfish. And put your bait near the tangles. So for casting, I'd highly recommend you practice the underhand pitch, just looping the line in an upside down arc, kind of like throwing a softball. The art of that cast is making sure that as the bait comes up in the arc, that it goes forward rather than upward. There's the backhand cast, which is just excellent if you're trying to cast underneath snags along the side of the bank. So if I'm casting to you, I don't stand like this and cast outward. I kind of turn sideways and just kind of flick it out. Another really good cast is what's called the bow and arrow cast, which I prefer when I'm using a bait cast reel in this type of circumstance. But what you can do, and by the way, I've heard bow and arrow cast used to describe two different methods of casting. I'm going to show you the one I prefer the most between the two, and that's what my version of the bow and arrow cast is going to be. You get some line in your hands like so, coming off the spool through one eyelet. So I've got my AC/DC fingers here, my hard rocking fingers, my pinky and my index finger holding two loops of line. And all I'm going to do is either an underhand pitch like this or kind of a backhand cast. And I'm going to let go of the line I've got right here. No more line will come off the spool. The line that's on the spool stays on the spool. It's all this extra line right here that will form enough line to give slack into my cast. So from here, like that. Now, like I said, prefer to use that for a bait casting reel. But if you need to drop your bait with a spinning reel into an awkward spot, that can work for you. Another important aspect of fishing for these bullhead catfish is patience. There's one there, a little pretty one. This is about average size for the bullheads. Quite a lovely one. This one has so much yellow. Not quite as dark as that larger one we saw earlier. And you do have to be careful with these, just like any other catfish. They have sharp spines. You can see the dorsal fin is erected on purpose by this fish while I'm grabbing him because it's very sharp and he's trying to keep me from being able to swallow him. That's why the pectoral spines are also flared out. Be very patient when you're fishing for these animals. You will lose a lot of gear in these snags. You will get a lot of turtles on your line. You will catch sunfish. You will catch gar. You will lose a lot of fish. It can be very frustrating fishing for bullhead catfish, but remain patient, get the right gear, short rod, decent line, long shanked hook, barbless hook, a meaty bait, go to the store with 99 cents, buy a package of hot dogs, or my #1 bullhead bait, chicken hearts. Touch ledger that bait, and you will end up catching, more likely than not, a lovely little bullhead catfish like this guy. Look at that face. It's like Kermit the Frog turned into a fish. One last thing to keep in mind that I forgot to mention. In my personal opinion, the bullhead catfish, pound for pound, has the strongest bite of any of the freshwater catfish in Texas. This little guy right here can bite with ridiculous amounts of force. And that's how they overpower, relatively large animals in relation to their body. You can see how big his stomach is. A big mouth and a big stomach means a fish that can take a very large prey item, relatively speaking. This catfish could probably swallow a fish a third its size. And that mouth is more than up to the job. And even though this fish is less than 10 inches long, if I let this guy get a hold of my finger, he could easily draw blood on my hand. Not from sharp teeth, they just have some rasping pads in there, but from the force at which it can bite. Very strong bite, so be careful. Let's let this guy go.